The first thing you notice is the smell, thick, sour, like iron left to rot in the sun. On the canals of Venice, boats begin to drift backward, carrying faces that should not exist yet, mouths moving silently in warning. Children watch toys rise from the water, teeth glinting in the moonlight, and the city exhales as if it's alive, rewriting time itself. Every step you take feels wrong. Every reflection moves against you, and you realize too late. The past is rising, and Venice has already devoured its own future. The first sign was the smell. Thick, sour, like iron burned and wet leather left to rot in the sun, it clung to the canals before anyone could see what had changed. On the outskirts of Venice, in the year 1723, the builders of a new canal noticed the water behaving as if it had memory, currents running against expectation, eddies curling backward, carrying the wooden hulls of barges upstream as though time itself had been twisted into knots. Passengers, or fragments of them, drifted across the surface, their faces pale, lips moving in silent rehearsal of words that no one could hear, eyes hollow with knowledge they had not yet earned. Every paddle stroke seemed resisted by an invisible hand, tugging boats and oars in reverse, forcing them to retrace paths that had never existed. The smell grew heavier as dusk approached, layered with the scent of rotting algae and the acrid tang of burnt resin, pressed into the air by the movement of water that ought not to move. Along the banks, houses began to show the first signs of a slow decay that was impossible, yet undeniable. Mildew bloomed in intricate patterns along the plaster, forming shapes reminiscent of fires long extinguished, walls recalling tragedies that had never touched this district. Moonlight fell across puddles gathered in the uneven cobblestones, but the reflections were distorted, warped into versions of the city that existed elsewhere, in other times, folding past and present together into something unrecognizable. Birds refused to land near the canal. Dogs and cats lingered at a cautious distance, tails low, ears pricked, as if the motion of the city had shifted slightly out of alignment with the world they knew. Shadows behaved strangely. Lamp posts cast elongated forms that stretched into alleys that had never been built, corners of buildings folded inward as if sighing under the weight of remembered events, and statues of saints along the waterfront seemed to turn their heads at impossible angles when no one approached. The workers, though trained to ignore small anomalies, could not resist the creeping sensation that each step along the edge of the canal was measured against an invisible ledger, one that recorded their presence and yet had no intention of ever releasing it. By the time night fully settled over Venice, the reversal of water had become ritualized. Barges glided backward with quiet inevitability, wheels scraping against wooden rails as if obeying commands from an unseen helmsman. Shadows of passengers shifted in the half-light, emerging and vanishing without pattern, some frozen mid-gesture, others caught in repetitions that suggested they were replaying moments from centuries before. The air itself grew thick with anticipation, each breath carrying the taste of old iron, damp leather, and something older still, the residue of futures that had not yet arrived. Street lamps flickered, reflecting in the dark water in a way that made even the familiar corners of the city seem alien. The workers noticed reflections in shop windows that moved independently of their own forms, mouths whispering threats, promises, and names that had no relation to the living. Cobblestones seemed to shift slightly underfoot, though each footstep left no trace, no indentation, no echo. The city exhaled decay and expectation in equal measure, and as the barges traced their impossible courses against gravity and time, every structure along the canal trembled imperceptibly, as if remembering something it had long been forbidden to forget. By midnight, the smell dominated every street and alley. It hung thick in the air, filling lungs and clinging to hair and clothing, marking those who had witnessed it as part of the water's slow, inexorable return. Nothing seemed violent, yet everything was wrong. The city itself had begun to breathe backward, inhaling nights that had never been lived and exhaling days that were yet to come. And in that suffocating, metallic tang, the builders realized the terrible truth. Venice was no longer merely a city, it was a memory in motion, and its memory moved against them. Footsteps became uncertain, hesitant, as though the very cobblestones of Venice had begun to question the direction of human intention. In the year 1723, the city's narrow streets, once predictable in their labyrinthine patterns, began to shift imperceptibly, corners elongating, alleys folding in upon themselves, leaving travelers with the sense that every step forward was an intrusion into someone else's memory. Merchants who passed mirrors in their shops recoiled when they saw themselves with expressions never previously worn, lips curling into warnings that had never been spoken, eyes darkened by secrets they did not know they carried, fingers trembling as if aware of errors still uncommitted. Some swore they saw themselves age and unage in moments, wrinkles fading and returning, hair darkening then paling, skin tightening then slackening, as the mirrors reflected not the present, but something ancient and impossible. The bells of St. Mark did not ring in any sequence that could be reconciled with human expectation. Each toll seemed to roll backward, a slow and deliberate unmaking of sound, spilling across rooftops and into the canals like ink dissolving into water. Their echoes, drawn upward into the sky, tangled with the wind and returned to the city inverted, a dissonant hymn that pressed against eardrums and lingered behind closed eyes. Sailors navigating the Grand Canal found their oars moving not with intention but against it, water splitting around blades as if resisting progress, carrying gondolas upstream toward quays that no longer existed, toward faces long dead yet momentarily animate, staring with hollow eyes and silent lips. Children who had once played freely near the canal discovered small, dark objects bobbing against the current, strange and unidentifiable. Fragments of toys that had been lost years before, ribbons frayed with age but stiffened by a strange dryness, even teeth that gleamed unnaturally in the moonlight, all drifted past their feet in defiance of expectation. They recoiled in shock, small bodies jerking backward as if repelled by invisible force, eyes widening in realization that the past itself was surfacing, pushing through the surface of the present. Shadows of forgotten misdeeds and vanished faces trailed along the edges of the water, bending toward the children, pressing at their senses, and they ran, but the air seemed thicker with each step, resisting their motion, whispering impossibilities through the shifting reeds and the creaking of timbered bridges. The city smelled wrong. A pungent mixture of brine, rot, and burnt sugar clung to every surface, saturating hair, skin, and clothing with its heavy insistence. From the docks, where the wood soaked centuries of moisture into itself, to the markets, where fish decayed and rose again, the stench was a constant, undeniable companion. It was the odor of memory pressed into physical form, of meals unconsumed, of fires that had burned and unburned, of breaths that had never been drawn yet left traces in the air. In some streets, the smell coalesced into tangible shapes, small clouded wisps of blackened smoke curling around doorways, lingering over windowsills, moving like smoke but heavier, infused with the sensation of watching. Passers-by found their throats tightening against a remembered hunger, their lungs choking on scents of long-dead meals, their stomachs twisting at phantom flavors. As evening descended, the city itself seemed to shiver. Windows reflected the wrong night sky, one stitched together from constellations that had not yet been catalogued, while the streets beneath shifted imperceptibly. Cobblestones lifted slightly, then settled into angles that no longer aligned with the memory of maps, leaving pedestrians feeling off balance, as though the very foundations of Venice were tilting toward some unknowable past. Doors opened into walls, staircases descended into ceilings, and no amount of retracing steps could restore logic to the urban maze. Street lamps flickered with impossible colors, deep blues and sickly greens that pulsed against the darkness, illuminating streets that appeared both familiar and alien at once. The merchants and sailors noticed subtle changes in their wares. Goods would return to their original state, bread unbaked, fish uncut, coins reshaping into smaller denominations that had not existed for decades. Books reverted to earlier editions, ink fading and letters imprinting themselves, pages folding inward to conceal words that had yet to be written. And yet, each reversal carried an urgency, a weight. Nothing undone seemed accidental. Even the air vibrated with purpose, resonating against the spine, pressing inward on those who lingered too long at the water's edge. The reflection of one's own hand, reaching toward the canal, often appeared in the water first, hovering a second longer than reality allowed, as if the city itself were learning to measure human intent and preempt it. By midnight, the movement of water and memory had intertwined completely. Barges floated backward in smooth, patient arcs, their shadows following arcs no longer consistent with the lights of the city. Figures on the docks could see themselves reflected in the canal, but the images were never simultaneous with their own motions. Eyes blinked before or after, mouths moved in words they could not hear, limbs bent into impossible angles. Statues lining the banks shivered subtly in the moonlight, stone skin contracting and releasing as if breathing through centuries at once. And above it all, the bells of St. Mark tolled in unison with the canal, a single heartbeat reversing through the veins of the city, pulling Venice into itself, inward toward the hollow core of forgotten events. Even those who attempted to sleep found no refuge. Dreams repeated themselves backward, and the past crept into consciousness with tactile weight. The brush of a hand that had never existed, the scent of smoke before fire, the taste of salt on lips unkissed. Waking became a liminal act, half in memory, half in the present, each breath carrying a suggestion that one's body had walked paths never taken. Windows revealed streets that were unbuilt, alleys that would collapse into non-existence by dawn, and across the canals, the water whispered names, soft and deliberate, a long litany of vanished citizens and unborn generations. By the end of the night, the air thickened further, as if the city were drawing breath and holding it in place of its residents. Every step against the current, every backward flick of water, every shadowed reflection and whispered name pressed upon the senses until movement felt optional. Thought became a hesitation, and even the simplest acts, the lifting of a hand, the turn of a foot, were measured against invisible scales of time and expectation. Venice no longer resembled a city of living people. It had become a living archive, cataloging, reversing, and observing, patient and indifferent, with the pungent smell of brine and decay seeping into the very marrow of those who dared to traverse its backward tides. By the end of the first month, the canal had become a force entirely alien to reason, twisting violently against every expectation. Wooden bridges that had been erected only the day before collapsed without warning, their timbers sinking into the mud as if the earth itself had rejected them, only to rebuild overnight, warped and crooked, carrying the memory of collapse within each grain of wood. Sailors navigating the Grand Canal began to report figures climbing aboard their vessels, corpses they did not recognize, faces drawn tight, with expressionless intent, eyes staring as if recalling lives they had never lived. Each apparition vanished without a trace before the first stroke of an oar, leaving a cold ripple across the water and a faint scent of iron and rot lingering in the air. Attempts to leave Venice proved futile. The tide, once obedient to human direction, now moved with invisible ropes, dragging boats, carts, and stray animals inexorably toward the city's center, pooling into the main canals as if the water itself were possessed by purpose. At dusk, the houses leaned closer to the streets, their windows wide like unblinking eyes freshly opened. Shutters twitched in response to unseen movements, and doors hummed with a low vibration, subtle yet insistent, as if the buildings themselves were aware of the city's intrusions. Smoke from chimneys curled upward in impossible angles, refusing to rise, then falling back like liquid ash, carrying the smell of burnt wood and stale bread, of lives uncompleted, of meals undelivered. The city exhaled a palpable tension. The air pressed heavier against the chest, pressing into the lungs with each breath, thick with the weight of futures being unmade. Alleyways bent in impossible curves, corners folding into themselves, leaving pedestrians disoriented, their sense of space unraveling with every step. In the markets, goods returned to their previous states. Fish uncut, bread unbaked, fruit unpicked, crates lifted and shifted as if guided by invisible hands, replacing every object in its precise, earlier arrangement. Merchants watched helplessly as coins reshaped themselves, melted into smaller denominations that had been removed from circulation decades ago. Books unread returned to shelves, pages folding inward, ink retracting into quills that had long decayed. The market was alive with a quiet, deliberate reversal, a slow unmaking of labor and human intention, and those who remained too long felt the weight of effort pressing back against their bodies, muscles resisting their will as though memory itself had become physical. Along the waterfront, gondolas drifted backward in silent arcs, shadows stretching impossibly across the canals, sometimes detaching entirely from the vessels they had been bound to, twisting along the water with their own secret purpose. Figures along the quays glimpsed their reflections in the moving water, but the images never coincided with their own motions. Eyes blinked out of sequence, lips curled into unspoken words, and hands rose and fell in gestures the real bodies had never performed. Statues along the banks twitched subtly, stone skin stretching and compressing, joints shifting as if each saint or nobleman had been awakened to bear witness to a chronology they could neither understand nor resist. The buildings themselves trembled imperceptibly, walls creaking as if the city were flexing its memory, testing the resilience of human bodies against the backward flow of time. Even the people began to change. Children aged backward before their parents' eyes, their hair darkening from gray to black, their limbs contracting as though pulled by some unseen cord. Adults found themselves forgetting decades in minutes, receding into earlier selves, undoing marriages, unlearning trades, and feeling the strange, insistent tug of years that had not yet arrived. The air around them pulsed with a subtle vibration, pressing into the spine, tugging at the heartbeat, coaxing thoughts backward along a path they could not control. Sleep brought no reprieve. Dreams ran in reverse, slipping through memories not yet lived, revealing streets unbuilt, faces unformed, and conversations that would never exist. At night, the canals carried fragments of the future and past together. Barges transported goods that had yet to be crafted, people who had yet to be born, shadows that flickered in and out of existence with a patience that outlasted the city's clocks. The smell of brine was thick and oily, mixed with the metallic tang of decay and the sharp sweetness of unburnt sugar. Wind, when it moved, carried whispers of warnings, half-words and fractured names that belonged neither to the living nor to the dead, scraping against ears and teeth, leaving a residue of unease in the mouths of those who wandered too far from solid ground. Even familiar streets betrayed their residents. Alleys opened into themselves, forming loops that trapped those who tried to trace familiar routes. Windows stared with recognition, some reflecting images of houses yet to be built, others revealing interiors abandoned centuries before. Lamps flickered and pulsed in impossible rhythms, casting shadows that curved and stretched along walls, aligning not with the light, but with memory itself. Pedestrians walked with care, yet every step forward felt met with resistance, as if Venice had grown conscious, shaping its streets to measure patience and fear, correcting missteps and punishing hesitation. By the end of the month, the city had become a living archive. It catalogued every misstep, every backward stroke of water, every hesitation, and every glance. Even the gondolas, drifting silently along impossible paths, carried fragments of lives once lived and lives yet to be, unbound by time, but intimately aware of its flow. The buildings exhaled slowly, deliberately, breathing out memory and expectation into the streets and canals. And in the hush of midnight, when the moon hung over the Grand Canal like a pale eye observing its subjects, the inhabitants realized the terrible truth. Venice no longer simply contained life. It contained time itself, rewound and restless, a patient and unyielding force that would neither release nor forgive. The magistrates convened in the Palazzo Ducale, their robes stiff with indignation and unease, and resolved to intervene, unaware that the city had already moved beyond governance, beyond reason. Engineers measured currents with instruments that spun backward, compasses twitching as if refusing allegiance, while water in the Grand Canal curled upstream with obstinate precision, dragging gondolas and debris into invisible eddies. Priests sprinkled holy water along the banks, chanting incantations that slipped into silence before the final syllable, the droplets rising from the stone like smoke, unforming into their original vessels of liquid, leaving no trace of blessing behind. Clockmakers, summoned from distant towns, counted hours backward on ornate faces, hands spinning counter to the sun, yet time continued its rebellion. Minutes unfolded into seconds that had never existed, hours retreated into hours yet unmeasured, and the city itself breathed with a rhythm entirely apart from human comprehension. Candles in shop windows melted in reverse, wax climbing from charred wicks to form letters that spelled warnings intelligible only in dreams. Shopkeepers and laborers who lingered too long at their posts felt the pull of memory against flesh. Hair graying in hours, roots extending into pale strands as though absorbing the light of a sun not yet risen, skin tightening against sinews and bone, youth receding into unrelenting age. Children, once playful along the edges of the canal, remembered their own births in vivid, uncomfortable detail, recalling the scent of midwives, the weight of unformed limbs, the silent cries of parents, while elders, once stalwart, forgot the last century in pieces, lost weddings, vanished markets, streets once familiar now alien and hostile. Those who attempted to intervene found their bodies betraying them, hands reaching for instruments, for ropes, for prayers, only to feel limbs unwind, fingers uncurling, hearts ticking backward against their will. The city itself was patient. It leaned in, slow and deliberate, as if aware of the efforts to resist it, its walls contracting and expanding like lungs, breathing out decay and rebirth in equal measure. Windows blinked along canals, some revealing rooms that had never been furnished, others showing interiors abandoned before their owners had been born. Bridges flexed against memory, collapsing in reverse and rebuilding in crooked perfection overnight, splintered timbers aligning themselves into forms that made sense only to the city. Reflections in water swirled with intentional malice, faces split, twisted, and reformed into versions that were neither past nor present, shadows detaching from bodies to float above the surface, silent observers of those still attempting to exert control. At night, the air thickened, not with mist, but with the pressure of reversed causality. Breath became a measured exercise, lungs filling and emptying out of sync with the world, heartbeat retreating into the chest in slow, deliberate pulses. Those who walked along the canals felt their steps unmade, one foot forward, then backward, returning to the stone before it had ever left, a sensation that disoriented the mind and gnawed at the resolve of even the strongest magistrate. The smell of Venice, the pungent mix of brine, rot, and burnt sugar, gathered intensity, settling in hair and clothing, binding memory to flesh, marking those who lingered as unwilling participants in the city's endless rehearsal. Wax from the candles climbed higher with a patient, cruel insistence, curling into symbols that had no language in the present. Merchants who tried to read them at dawn found themselves remembering transactions that had not yet occurred, debts that could not exist, names that were simultaneously theirs and strangers. Fish returned to their natural, uncut state in markets, bread unwoven from ovens. Coins shrunk and remade into denominations long removed from circulation, each reversal precise, deliberate, a proof of the city's unyielding awareness. Even the pigeons along piazzas moved against instinct, wings beating in reverse, landing where they had never been, pecking at seeds that had yet to fall from the trees. Sleep offered no refuge. Dreams unfolded in reverse like ribbons, memories unspooling with tactile force, laughter retreating into silence, tears ascending back into eyes, conversations undone as words climbed back into mouths. Waking was no relief. The city pressed into consciousness with the same deliberate patience. Street lamps flickered in colors impossible to name, illuminating alleys that did not exist, staircases that led to ceilings, doors that opened into walls. Shadows of saints and nobility along canals twitched with imperceptible purpose, joints bending as if the city's memory demanded they witness the undoing of human intervention. Those who had attempted to escape found themselves undone before they could act. Boats tethered to quays loosened and returned to their docks without human effort. Animals retraced steps they had never walked, and the wind itself conspired to push against those who tried to leave. Even speech failed. Words climbed backward up throats, exiting before they could form, leaving mouths with the taste of old iron and ash, tongues heavy with syllables that refused to exist. Every object touched, every movement made, became part of the city's catalog, recorded in the precise language of reversal, the geometry of negation, until each person understood that resistance was measured, weighed, and corrected before it could matter. By the end of the month, Venice had become an organism aware of the intentions of its inhabitants. Bridges flexed, water curled, buildings leaned, and reflections moved independently, but all with an order that suggested nothing was arbitrary. Time was no longer linear. It was a tide against which human life could only drift, pulled backward in patience and precision. Hair, skin, memory, thought, breath itself, all moved in reverse when watched too closely, unmaking the living as if to remind them that the city contained not only space and architecture, but causality itself. The magistrates, engineers, priests, and clockmakers, exhausted and hollow-eyed, realized too late that Venice had never needed them. Their interventions were recorded and then unrecorded, counted and uncounted, erased in a deliberate rhythm that matched the city's own heartbeat. The wax returned to wicks, coins shrank into oblivion, fish uncut, bread undone, and the streets pulsed with quiet malice. By the stroke of midnight, all who had tried to resist found themselves partially unwound, thoughts and memories retreating, bodies subtly reverting, names slipping from records before they could be written. And in that patient, measured pressure, the city waited, knowing the next attempts to escape would be met with the same inexorable reversal, each failure recorded and then erased, endlessly, deliberately, and without mercy. Months passed, though the measurement of time had lost all meaning, each day folding backward into the one before it, the hours unspooling like threads pulled from a tapestry that no one could remember weaving. Boats drifted along the Grand Canal, carrying entire markets in reverse, crates spilling their contents into streets that had not yet been paved, fruit returning to trees, bread dissolving into unbaked dough, fish leaping backward from the stalls into the waters from which they had been drawn. Citizens walked along the canals with faces that flickered like paintings under candlelight, sometimes showing themselves as strangers, sometimes as ancestors long dead, eyes widening in recognition that could not exist, mouths forming words they had not yet spoken, gestures retracting into impossibility. Even the shadows of lamp posts stretched backward along the stones, coiling around the edges of buildings, vanishing and reforming like smoke tethered to memory. By nightfall, the silence over the canals had thickened into something almost tactile, viscous enough to cling to hair and skin, pressing against the lungs with deliberate patience, interrupted only by the low, grating creak of timbers bending under the weight of history not yet written. Bridges groaned as they reassembled themselves from splintered planks, arches forming and unforming in a rhythm dictated by the city's own unyielding will. Gondolas appeared and disappeared along invisible currents, sometimes carrying the same passengers multiple times, looping through moments that had not yet happened, their eyes wide with confusion and fear they could not name. Water lapped against the hulls with a cadence that suggested awareness, small waves curling toward and away from the city simultaneously, as if the canals themselves were breathing in time with the thoughts of those who lingered too long along their edges. Markets existed in a state of impossible flux. Sacks of grain returned to the fields, loaves of bread unbaked into flour, coins rising from the canals and clinking arcs and reforming in denominations that had been retired decades ago. Merchants tried to count what they had lost, but hands retreated along tables as if guided by invisible strings, fingers uncurling, objects unheld, memories of transactions dissolving into nothing. The smell of Venice was thick and disorienting, a mixture of brine, burnt sugar, and wet leather, layered with the faint copper tang of unmade blood, as if every unfulfilled intention left a residue in the air. Children ran backward across plazas, their feet leaving no prints, toys retreating into the hands of their owners before they had been created, laughter folding into silence, echoing in a language that belonged neither to past nor present. The buildings themselves seemed aware of the unfolding chaos. Windows rearranged their panes, reflecting corridors that had yet to exist, walls contracting and stretching with the pulse of a city that had learned to measure patience in centuries rather than minutes. Doors opened into alleys that would never be built, staircases spiraled downward only to rise again in the same instant, and shutters moved as if breathing, inhaling light and exhaling shadows that clung to the streets in long, deliberate arcs. Statues along the canals flexed subtly, eyes tracking pedestrians with a consciousness beyond stone, their carved mouths forming expressions of warning that vanished when the gaze shifted. Even the pigeons along piazzas participated in the backward rhythm, wings lifting in reverse, returning to nests that had not yet been built, pecking at seeds that would fall only years from now. At midnight, a single gondola drifted slowly toward the Piazza San Marco, carrying fragments of a future that had already been forgotten. Its passenger, a young woman whose name had not yet been spoken, sat upright, hands folded, hair streaming behind her as though the current of time itself tugged at every strand. The city seemed to inhale in unison, the water pulsing around the gondola, as if aware of the improbable convergence, pulling her forward even as her own body receded into moments that had not yet existed. Reflections in the water multiplied, showing her as a child, as an elder, as a stranger. Each image blinked independently, forming a mosaic of impossibilities, eyes staring back with silent understanding that the forward motion she expected would never arrive. In the alleys leading to the canal, merchants and passers-by paused, unnerved by the sensation of the city's consciousness pressing against their skin. Hands twitched involuntarily, feet dragging backward along cobblestones, breath moving in irregular rhythms, chest tightening against a weight they could not name. Candles and windows climbed their wicks in reverse, wax forming letters that spelled warnings unintelligible in waking life, but vivid in dreams, the message curling and unspooling as if time itself were writing and erasing in the same gesture. The smell of unbaked bread, wet stone, and burnt sugar thickened in the air, interlacing with the copper tang of waterborne decay, creating a miasma that seeped into memory, leaving every observer unmoored from chronology. The gondola reached the center of the square, the water beneath it curling into impossible forms, reflecting buildings that had not yet been built and streets that had been erased before their creation. The city, patient and relentless, watched its own mechanics unfold, a clockwork of reversed causality that tolerated no interruption. Citizens were caught in its invisible eddies, hair regressing to infancy, voices unspoken, gestures undone, memories climbing backward along the spine like fingers undoing the stitches of life. Even the moon seemed to retreat in the sky, waning into a shape that had never existed, casting a pale, impossible light across the plaza, illuminating Venice as both past and future in the same breath. By dawn, the gondola and its passenger had vanished, leaving only a faint ripple in the canal and a smell of iron and wet leather lingering in the air. The city exhaled slowly, the silence of midnight giving way to a quiet that was no relief but another measure of its patience. Citizens awoke with memories undone, objects unheld, gestures unmade, as if the night had unrolled existence like a scroll and rolled it back again. Venice continued its patient observation, canals reversing, buildings breathing, reflections flickering, a city alive in its own impossible logic, measuring time not in hours or years, but in the slow, deliberate unmaking and remaking of every life contained within its walls. Every observer felt, at some level they could not articulate, that the city's mechanics were complete, yet incomplete, patient, and infinitely aware, and that nothing, not one step, not one breath, not one thought, would escape its relentless, backward-moving gaze. When the first dawn arrived, it was not a dawn at all. Light spilled backward across the sky, an inverted glow that traced shadows in reverse, sending them skittering against their owners, bending over cobblestones and canals as though fleeing from a time that had already passed. The air was heavy with the scent of unmade bread, brine returning to the sea, and the faint, sour tang of human decay yet to occur. Streets that had been paved yesterday now unraveled into rubble, stones lifting and scattering themselves across empty squares, as if undoing centuries of labor in a single, deliberate motion. Bridges, once standing proud over the Grand Canal, uncurved and twisted, planks lifting from arches only to vanish into air that had never existed, leaving gaps in the city that were both absence and memory. The magistrates, summoned for the final reckoning, were gone before their authority could take shape, their decrees curling into smoke and fading into the unrecorded past, ink dissolving back into quills as if it had never been. Citizens awoke to a city that no longer obeyed any law of matter or logic. Every step they had ever taken had been unmade, returning feet to their original unformed position, every meal eaten dissolved into hunger yet to be felt, every word spoken lifted back into throats, leaving tongues heavy and mouths empty. Children found their toys retreating into hands that had not yet grasped them, laughter shrinking and folding into silence before sound could exist. Reflections in the Grand Canal moved with perverse autonomy, smiling or frowning in anticipation of moments that had not yet occurred, eyes widening in recognition that no one alive could understand. Faces of ancestors and strangers merged with their own, forming mosaics that blinked independently, mouths curling into expressions of warnings long before knowledge could form. Windows along the canals rearranged themselves, panes twisting to reveal rooms that would never be furnished, interiors breathing in rhythm with the city's unyielding will, curtains lifting as if inhaling the impossible history of those who had passed through them. The water pulsed with a consciousness all its own, ripples crawling upstream, folding into themselves, carrying debris backward into empty streets and alleys that had not yet been paved. Gondolas moved as though tugged by invisible hands, passengers frozen in impossible postures, hair streaming in reverse currents, eyes wide with the understanding of futures never lived. Fish leapt from the market stalls into the canals, then unleapt, bodies coiling backward into the unseen nets from which they had not yet been drawn. Even the pigeons along the piazzas moved against instinct, wings folding in reverse to lift them into nests that had never been built, cooing in the quiet hum of a city that had learned to measure all things in undoing. Buildings flexed subtly, leaning against each other with quiet menace, walls breathing in tandem with the backward rhythm of Venice. Statues along the canals twisted at their joints, heads pivoting to follow citizens who had already retreated from existence, eyes blinking out of sync, carved mouths forming smiles or warnings that dissolved as soon as they were observed. The city smelled of wet leather, brine, unburnt candle, and iron not yet spilled, pressing into hair, skin, and memory with a patient insistence. Citizens felt their bodies unwind, muscles unflexing, spines contracting into moments before they were built, and minds recoiling as memories climbed backward along nerves, undoing identity in the gentle, inexorable way of time undone. Candles in the windows grew taller, wax curling upward to the unburnt wick, letters forming and dissolving in midair, warnings intelligible only in dreams that had yet to be dreamt. The air trembled with impossible pressure, a sensation that stretched skin and compressed bone, making the act of movement feel like a choice undone. Footfalls returned to their origin, and even the sound of breathing followed suit, lungs unfilling, heartbeats retreating in counterpoint to the march of days that had never arrived. The moon, hanging in the backward sky, cast pallid, impossible light across the canals, illuminating a city that existed both and neither, at once real and undone, a place where causality itself had been rewritten. In the Grand Canal, a boy leaned over the edge and saw his reflection grin before he was born, teeth forming in a jaw that had not yet existed, eyes widening with the knowledge of futures not yet made. For a moment, Venice inhaled as a single, impossible body, pulsing with the backward tide of its own history, conscious of every gesture, every breath, every unmade step. The citizens stood frozen, suspended between having lived and never existing, caught in a current of time reversed and remade according to the will of the city itself. Buildings, bridges, and streets continued to flex, water curling against its own flow, reflections flickering, shadows moving against their owners, and every object and thought was catalogued in the deliberate language of undoing. By the hour that should have been noon, the city exhaled its final secret. Venice had never existed in the linear sense. Every act, every footprint, every stone laid, every canal dug had been recorded only to be immediately unmade, leaving the living to wander in a city that was present only in the tension of their perception. Citizens tried to speak, to act, to understand, but words climbed backward into throats, gestures returned to pre-intent, and memories dissolved into a haze of impossibility. Every heartbeat, every silent breath, every footfall became proof of a place that had ceased to be, yet lingered as an echo, a pressure, a living record of its own undoing. Time, water, and matter followed the city as well, the past devouring itself, leaving only awareness behind, and those who remained found themselves both observers and phantoms, haunting a city that had never existed, yet imprinted itself into every sinew, every nerve, every fragment of consciousness that dared to linger. Venice, patient, deliberate, and eternal, had devoured its own existence, leaving the living to bear witness to its absence, a proof that memory and reality are not bound by chronology, only by the city's own merciless, backward-moving will.